in this paper. There are images of art depicting violence, a discussion of physical and sexual violence, discussion of trauma, and a sculpture depicting a bone. So over to you, Claire.
Great, thank you so much. It's going to be tough to follow that, but I will do my best. Just share my PowerPoint. Sorry, it's not letting me get to the presenter. Okay, we might just have to do it like this because my laptop's having a bit of a hissy fit. Can everybody see that? Okay. Okay. So thank you, Marta, for covering the content warnings. That's just them quickly again, in case anyone needed them. And I will begin my talk. In classical archaeology, phenomenology has become increasingly popular following the material turn, bringing a growing focus on sensory experience and the first-person human-object relationship as generative of meaning. However, this new popularity has reproduced many of the flaws of the phenomenological framework as originally formulated by Merleau-Ponty, in failing to consider a full range of orientations and perspectives as potentially transformative for the object meanings and histories that we are constructing. Sara Ahmed's queer phenomenology offers us an expanded framework for thought about first-person experience, and particularly about first-person experience of the material world, expanding on Merleau-Ponty's queer moments of disorientation. Ahmed points to the problem of phenomenology, that our orientation, as determined by our histories and experiences, affects which objects and spaces we perceive and how we perceive them. Orientation is not just about sexual orientation, but is more widely about how we reside in space and how we engage with the material world, which objects we are orientated towards or away from, or that we approach askew, shifting our understanding of the object from its straight or direct meaning. Ahmed draws attention to this disorientation as characteristic of bodies that have their orientation in the world called into crisis due to their sexuality, race, class, and life histories. Disorientation can be a bodily feeling of losing one's place and an effect of the loss of place, and a feeling that is affected by violence or shaped by violence directed towards the body. Orientation is constructed by what is behind the body and the conditions of its arrival to a space. Scholars like Barbara Voss, Sara Levin-Richardson, Cheryl Morgan, Danielle Padilla-Peralta, and Dawn Rutecki are part of the wider movement within classics to bring other orientations and other bodies with different histories to our understanding of the ancient world. Nonetheless, in classics, and particularly in classical archaeology, there has been a consistent reluctance to introduce the subjectivity of different readings into scholarship. This is particularly pernicious at the intersection of the study of classics, a historically monocultural discipline, which was long dominated by one neutral kind of scholar whose neutrality was ensured by their proximity to whiteness, maleness, straightness, and upclass social position, and archaeology, a discipline which often considers itself closer to science, and thus some kind of scientific objectivity in the study of tangible material remains. There has rarely been space for the real messiness of queerness within classical archaeology. Using Ahmed's phenomenology, we can perhaps begin to think more subjectively about our objects, to wildly speculate, to consider what they might mean to people like us in the past, even when we are told that drawing such lines is too simplistic, and giving a little more room to the anachronism that is apparently anathematic to serious classical studies. My aim in this talk is to attempt some experimental readings using Ahmed's phenomenology to examine what she calls the strangeness that exists between the body and the object, and summoning forth the potential histories of these artifacts in order to reframe our own orientation towards them as scholars. I aim to show the value of using queer phenomenology and queer readings of previously straightened items to create new narratives in archaeology. I am also partially following the lead of Cheryl Morgan in this, who spoke earlier today. As other scholars have done, I am taking the queer in queer archaeologies as related both to sexuality and desire, and to wider non-normative experiences, looking for those strange, odd, alienated individuals that are too often left out of classical archaeology and ancient art history. I also want to give a quick heads up that for the next section of the talk, I'm going to be talking about violence and trauma quite extensively, probably for about the next 5 to 10 minutes. I want to begin with a particular iteration of the figure of the Amazon in Roman art in the death scene of the Amazon Queen Penthesilea. As I don't have time to give you a full history of the Amazon in classical art, I hope you will all forgive me for making some really generalized statements to set up the context of this particular type scene. In my opinion, the character of the Amazon in Greco-Roman culture exists as a projection of many types of wrongness or otherness that is both gendered and racialized, reflected in their status as woman warriors and as Easterners, represented by their common costume of the exposed breast, Phrygian cap, and pelter shield. They are in many ways totally antithetical to Romanness, and particularly to Roman ideas of womanhood. As a result, they are constantly being punished across all different types of media. In art, the Amazon, much like the Greek image of the Persian or the Roman image of the Dacian, is always beaten down, wounded, dragged, or killed. Often their subjugation is made clear in the formal characteristics of the art that depicts them. They appear in the lower axes of the scene, on their knees, or lying already dead. These scenes of Amazon subjugation are often seen as analogues for the success of the true civilization of Greek and Roman masculine cultures that depict them. The character of Penthesilea is broadly representative of these patterns in Amazon representation. She is shown as the victim of Achilles, often on her knees or already falling to the ground mortally wounded, as you can see in a few of these examples from both Greek and Roman art. So, a shift comes in the mid to late imperial period when the romantic element of this narrative, described by Quintus Menes in his late Roman reworking of the Aethiopis, becomes the focus of the scene, in line with the period's greater tendency to eroticize the Amazon image. The text of this Menes is just up there in case anyone wants to read it. It's a bit fruity. As Gensheimer and Welch put it, at first it was the killing of Penthesilea itself that was emphasized, but later it was the fact that Penthesilea dies in Achilles' arms. A significant portion of depictions of the scene appear on sarcophagi in a highly repetitive scheme. The composition of the scene it promotes a romantic reading. The moment depicted is not the moment of Penthesilea's wounding, but instead after Achilles has fallen in love with her, holding her and shielding her from the ongoing war that surrounds them. The pair are central, projected forwards from the conflict behind them, and Penthesilea's wound is gone from the scene, as are her weapons. This scene has been interpreted in scholarship as a romantic analogue for the relationship between husband and wife, used for the sarcophagi of married couples, an impression which is furthered by the common use of portrait heads on the two central figures, where individualized facial features and contemporary Roman hairstyles are added to personalize the scene. Zanker and Ewald explain the use of the scene on sarcophagi as giving expression to the husband's love and his role as protector, with the scene becoming a parable of great love in the vein of other mythological sarcophagi. They explicitly state the need to ignore Achilles' role in the death of Penthesilea for this reading of the scene, which has gone on to be widely adopted by scholars of Roman sarcophagi. However, I don't believe that the violent context of this great love would be so easily elided for all ancient viewers. Important studies have been done on the constant presence of violence in the Roman world for members of certain demographics, for the enslaved, for the victims of expanding Roman imperialism, for women of all classes, and for many sex workers, free and enslaved. This is where the potential for a disorientation of viewing comes in, and with it, an alternative reading of the scene. In contemporary psychological thought, we often understand traumatic experiences of violence as resulting in a consistent sense of present and severe threat for the individual. Trauma becomes a strangeness that resides in the body. The modern cognitive understanding is that the traumatized brain fails to timestamp these traumatic experiences as happening in the past, disturbing linear time. This notion of being out of time and emotionally dysregulated seems to have many parallels with the failed orientations of Sara Ahmed. As we can imagine, as Ahmed says, that experiences of violence are events which produce disorientation in individuals, which in turn might serve to alter viewing of violent images, complicating the process of identification in the image that is described by scholars such as Zanker and Ewald. A recurrent problem in ancient art history is that historically many prominent scholars read works of art and identify themselves with the male Roman citizen or their artistic analogues, perhaps the result of a disciplinary history that has drawn straight lines between Greco-Roman civilization and the education and rule of powerful men in the colonial West. That this viewpoint holds sway as the most central and objective one works to the exclusion of other viewers and other orientations. Not everyone in the Roman world viewing artworks would have existed within the categories of man, citizen, or Roman. While Amazons are fictional characters, the non-normative characteristics that they represent as foreign and monstrously gendered women are real and represented across the Roman population. It seems to me that this scene can be read from a different angle, where the focal center is not Achilles and his love, but Penthesilea and her brutal death. This is furthered by the wider culture of representation of this scene. While in the marriage sarcophagi we have no wound and no weapons, these elements are common in representations elsewhere, especially in public statuary, and serve to make violence in the narrative more explicit. In the statue from Aphrodisias, a copy of Hellenistic type known from examples across the empire, the wound of Penthesilea is not just modelled on the skin, but painted in red and then again in black pigment to make it dark and striking against the marble. On the basal heads, the same statue type from a different location, even as Achilles cradles Penthesilea's head in his hand, he grips her hair in a pose that recalls the gripping of Amazons by the hair as they are pulled from their horses as they try and flee. Figures commonly repeated across Roman Amazonic scenes. This is just some of the wider culture of representation that informs these scenes that are now being read as romantic. Thus, we can imagine some disturbance in our reading of the scene as bringing up emotional responses that do not center romance, loyalty, or deep love suggested by certain scholars. Instead, for the disorientated viewer, directed by their own experience of violence, the scene might instead recall fear, brutality, and trauma linked to the continued presence or the threat of violence which results from those traumatic memories which exist out of time. This is one form of disorientated reading that I think is possible for ancient objects whose violence hasn't really been properly reckoned with, but I don't want to give the impression that the only thing defined in queer archaeologies is struggle or pain, or that those elements are the defining feature of queer experience in the past. In my second case study, I want to think quickly about the potential for objects to act as mediators of queer desire in the ancient world. In my PhD research, I work predominantly on religious miniatures, and one of the starting points for this talk was in thinking about how the miniature offers a private, intimate, alternative world for the owner, and the potential for that to be a queer world, serving alternative private desires. A great deal of miniaturization theory centers around the idea that the shrinking of an image constructs a particular intimacy within the human-object relationship, shaped by the form and scale of the object, which invites you to hold in your hand, to break the barrier of touch, and to bring it close to examine its often intricate details. In the archaeological record from Pompeii and Herculaneum, there are many of these small gods, often produced as elements of jewelry, pendants, earrings, and beads, and mostly measuring between 2 and 4 centimeters tall. These items of jewelry are not restricted to ownership by one gender, but as I am discussing queer desire and for brevity, I'm going to discuss predominantly their use by women. One of the most common divine types for miniatures in this area is of Venus Anadyomene, the goddess depicted as if rising nude from the sea, holding her hair. Venus has a local importance in her iteration as Venus Pompeiana, the principal deity of the city, and her popularity in items of jewelry, both in this region and elsewhere, has often been explained through her role as an advocate in matters of love and marriage, as well as her divine representation of beauty.
Sorry, it's 15 minutes already. Sorry.
I'll try and wrap up quickly. Her appearance is often associated with that nebulous concept of fertility, used as a catch-all phrase for concerns related to marriage, love, childbirth, and the family. Ahmed's description of the impact of compulsory heterosexuality is relevant here, as the fantasy of a natural orientation, which acts as an orientation device that organizes worlds around it in the form of the heterosexual couple, as if it were from this point that the world unfolds. The alignment the alignment between the popularity of these very personal miniaturized Venus images and fertility shows one way in which compulsory heterosexuality shapes our object biographies, creating a world of narrative where women's personal items and motivations must naturally be directed towards the family unit. It kind of has similarities with the example Ahmed uses of the fondue pot. I'm just going to skip ahead quickly. So the idea of the nude Venus as a focal point of desire isn't really surprising to anyone. But while these kind of miniature items aren't nearly as beautifully carved or richly staged as the kind of large-scale statues that are described in ancient art history, they have a specific relationship with the body. They hold a close contact because they're being worn as charms or amulets, and they become a focal point for touch and even prayer. They offer the possibility of a personalized religious practice where Venus is an advocate in love and desire, but perhaps also a focal point of love and desire herself, or as an appropriate mediator for wider feelings of queer desire. The goddess of beauty is naked and she is beautiful and she belongs to you. Here, miniatures of this are offering something more. The image of a nude goddess becomes a private possession and a personal object for viewing whenever the owner wishes, offering a quiet world mediated by the object where queer desire might flourish. Thank you, that's the end. And I wanted to say a particular thank you to the collective in general for letting me be part of this conference and also part of the collective. It's a real academic highlight of my life so far.